The stars are right, and that means it's time for another episode of The Whisper in Darkness. I'm your host, the Man from Ling. Thank you very much for joining me today. On today's episode, I am reviewing the player cards from Where Doom Awaits, the 5th Mythos pack in the Dunwich Legacy cycle. There are 14 new player cards in this pack, and a lot of them are really exciting. I can't wait to tell you about them. There are spoilers throughout if you care about that sort of thing, so let's get started. The first Guardian card in the pack is Leadership. It's a skill with one wild icon, the practice trait, and the game text. While Leadership is committed to a skill test performed by another investigator, Leadership gains a willpower icon and a wild icon. Now this appears to be the Guardian's addition to the series of skill cards with 3 icons like we saw in previous packs, including Inquiring Minds for Seeker and Rise to the Occasion for Survivors. This card is really thematic, and it's another card that cements Guardian as one of the premier support classes in the game. Now in solo play, Leadership is a blank card with a wild icon, so it's unlikely to see much play in that format. I guess you could include it in a deck for the wild icon if you value the flexibility, but there are probably better options if you're including a card in your deck just for the icons. Roland Banks, for example, he can just take Inquiring Minds, which is a much stronger card in solo play. So can Zoe Samras, for that matter, if she's willing to take it as one of the 5 level 0 cards from any other class. In multiplayer, this card is a less flexible version of Inquiring Mind. You can only pitch it to a test performed by another investigator, and you're only going to get full value out of it if it is a willpower test. Otherwise, Leadership is no better than an Unexpected Courage. Now that's still pretty good in terms of a skill boost, and I think a lot of investigators would be pretty happy to pack 4 copies of Unexpected Courage in their deck for multiplayer, even if they could only play 2 of them on their own skill checks. All in all, I think Leadership is too weak for solo play, but it will pull its weight in multiplayer, especially if you're teamed up with an investigator like Skids O'Toole, who wants all the extra willpower icons that he can get his grubby little rogue hands on. The second Guardian card in the pack is I've Had Worse. It's a 0-cost event that costs 4 experience points. It has 2 willpower and 1 agility icon and the spirit trait. It has the game text Fast. Play when you are dealt damage and or horror. Cancel up to 5 damage and or horror just dealt to you, then gain that many resources. FFG spoiled this card months ago when it released its preview article for Where Doom Awaits, and I'm still pretty enthusiastic about it. Dodge is a staple in most Guardian decks, and this card is very similar to Dodge in that it allows you to avoid an incoming attack. Not only do you get to avoid the attack, but you also gain up to 5 resources for your trouble, which is a nice down payment on a weapon to hit back in a later turn. That's pretty awesome, particularly in a Roland Banks deck who tends to be quite poor because he lacks the resource generation of an investigator like Zoe Samras. I'm not looking forward to seeing the monster, however, that can dish out a combination of 5 damage and or horror, but at least with this card in your deck you'll be ready to face it. As good as this card is, I'm not certain how much play it's going to see. 4 experience points is on the high side, and this card does face some stiff competition from other Guardian cards that cost 4 or 5 experience, including the shotgun from the core set and the lightning gun, which will be released in Lost in Time and Space. I think many Guardians will be tempted to upgrade their weapon first, which means this card might not appear in decks until much later during the campaign, if at all. The next card in the pack is the first of a trio of Seeker cards based on one of the coolest cards in the Dunwich Legacy big box. This is Strange Solution, Restorative Concoction. It is a 1-cost asset that costs 4 experience points. It has 2 willpower icons and the item and science traits. It has the game text, you can only include this asset in your deck by upgrading it from Strange Solution, unidentified, and only if you have identified the solution in your campaign log. It enters play with 4 supplies, and you can take an action to spend 1 supply to heal 2 damage from an investigator at your location. Strange Solution Unidentified is easily one of the most fascinating cards released for the Arkham Horror LCG so far, so it's great to find out what happens if you take the time to identify the solution. This is the 5th card in the game that heals damage, the others being the Guardian Event Emergency Aid, the Guardian Asset First Aid, and the Seeker Asset Medical Texts and the Neutral Asset Painkillers. I rarely include healing cards in my deck for 2 reasons. First of all, most of them require you to take an action to benefit from their effect, and using one of my precious actions to heal 1 damage doesn't seem like it's particularly worthwhile. Secondly, damage has rarely been an issue during any of my Dunwich Legacy campaigns. Thus far, horror is a far greater concern, and the Restorative Concoction doesn't really do anything to heal that. Unfortunately, the Restorative Concoction's effect feels really underwhelming for 4 experience points. It heals 2 damage, which makes it twice as effective as most of the other options, but it still takes an action, which makes it only marginally better than medical texts, and neither Daisy nor Rex should have much trouble passing an Intellect 2 test. And then there's the awkward upgrade path. Now, this is a problem with all 3 of the Strange Solution upgrades we see in this pack. Once you've identified the solution, you've got to keep the Strange Solution in your deck until you've got the experience to upgrade it. That's annoying, but I don't think it makes the upgrades unplayable by any stretch of the imagination. If you're planning on upgrading a Strange Solution or 2 during the Dunwich Legacy campaign, you should be able to earn enough experience to do it relatively early on in the campaign through extracurricular activity, and the house always wins. Now, I don't see myself adding Strange Solution Restorative Concoction to my Seeker decks for the time being, but that could change if direct damage becomes a thing in scenarios in the future. The second upgrade of the trio is Strange Solution Acidic Ichor. It has 2 combat icons, 3 supply, and the game text, spend 1 supply, fight, attack with a base combat skill of 6. This attack deals +2 damage. Now, this card is the bomb. I dropped a couple of these into a solo Daisy deck that I've been playing around with in standalone mode and proceeded to murder everything in her path. Silas Bishop giving you trouble? Dead. What about his brother Seth? Dead. Attacking with a combat skill of 6 and dealing 3 damage per attack turns your lovable nerd into a frightening combat monster. Now, I know some players will compare this to the shotgun from the core set, but I think it's even better than the Guardian weapon from the core set in almost every way. The shotgun costs 4 experience points, just like the Acidic Ichor, but it costs 5 resources to play. The Acidic Ichor costs a measly 1 resource. The shotgun has 2 ammo, while the Acidic Ichor has 3 supply. The shotgun takes up both your hand slots, and the Acidic Ichor doesn't take up any. I think of all the benefits of the Acidic Ichor, it's that the latter one that really struck me during my games with Daisy. Acidic Ichor gives Seekers access to a shotgun caliber weapon, and they don't even have to give up any of their magnifying glasses or tomes in order to use it. And it feels pretty broken when you get this down on the table with all of your other goodies. Strange Solution Acidic Ichor is a bloody amazing card. It has the same awkward upgrade path as the Restorative Concoction, but I would gladly jump through a few hoops early in a campaign to have access to it later. This is another great card for the Seeker arsenal. Seekers certainly seem to be getting great cards in each of the packs we've seen so far, and this is just another one of those. The third and final upgrade available is Strange Solution Freezing variant. It has 2 agility icons, 4 supply, and the action spend 1 supply, evade. Evade with a base agility skill of 6. Now, this seems better than the Restorative Concoction, but I haven't played enough Seeker to know whether they would be willing to go all in on an evasion strategy with a card like this. I took a quick peek at some of the Daisy and Rex decks over at Arkham DB, and evasion doesn't seem like it's a big priority for a lot of them. Many of the Rex decks tend to adopt the F-Bones style, foregoing evasion in favor of a strong offensive option such as Fire Axe and I've Got a Plan. Many of the recent Daisy builds also focus on offense, relying on shriveling to take down enemies and falling back on Blinding Light in emergencies. The game favors killing enemies over evading them right now, which makes me think that most players will gravitate toward the acidic I-core over the freezing variant in a heartbeat. However, there are some Seeker builds that rely on hyper-awareness, mind over matter, and manual dexterity for evasion. These cards are common in Rex decks that try and leverage the resources gained from Dr. Mylan Christopher and Burglary to fuel agility checks with hyper-awareness. I could certainly see Freezing Variant finding a home in those decks, freeing up resources for deck slots and deck slots for other assets. Now, I've played around with a few evasion-based decks in other classes, and I found the card pool wasn't quite there in terms of support for the archetype. Personally, I'd like to see evasion strategies to be as effective as combat-oriented ones, but at the moment, killing enemies gets you victory points, while evading them just gives you a warm, fuzzy feeling for a turn or two. Perhaps FFG will release an evasion-oriented Seeker down the road who can leverage Freezing Variant to greater effect. Maybe Monterey Jack. He seems like just the guy to incorporate a heavy evasion mechanic. The first rogue card in the pack is Joey the Rat Vigil, looking out for number 1. He's a 4-cost asset with intellect and agility icons. He has the ally and criminal traits and takes up the ally slot, as they all do. He has a free trigger, spend 1 resource, choose an item asset from your hand and play it, paying its cost. The rat has 3 health and 2 sanity. Well, here's another take on the rogue theme of generating action advantage. For the price of a resource, the rat will let you play any item in your hand as though it were fast. Now, as of Where Doom Awaits Mythos pack, there were almost 50 items for investigators to choose from, ranging from the 41 Derringer to Zoe's Cross, symbol of righteousness, although I think most investigators in the rat's service will probably stick to more traditional items such as the flashlight, machetes, and liquid courage. The question is whether paying a resource for the rat's commission to play your items without taking an action is worth it. Unfortunately for the rat, his racket faces some stiff competition from Leo DeLuca from the core set. I think in most decks and most situations, Leo is a better choice in terms of pure efficiency. Besides his high upfront cost, Leo asks nothing of the investigator for the extra actions, while the rat's ability comes at a price, and that extra resource is going to add up fast in a class that already relies on a lot of cards that are hungry for resources. However, I'm not ready to squeal on the rat yet. I can think of at least one situation when the rat is better than Leo, and that is if the investigator gets ambushed by an enemy. Paying the rat's commission for Jenny's twin 45s is going to be a lot more appealing than taking an attack of opportunity in most cases. The rat could help an investigator play a copy of Painkillers or Smoking Pipe in a pinch to ward off imminent death or insanity. You can also use the rat's ability during another player's turn, although I can't think of any benefit of doing that at the moment. It's important to point out that while Leo grants you an additional action per turn, you can trigger the rat as many times as you like if you've got the resources and items to spare. You might be able to set up some pretty explosive turns if you play to the rat's strengths. You never know, there might be a seed for a deck there if you combine the rat with a lot of items and a couple copies of Hot Streak or other resource-generating cards to pay his commission. Skids might also consider doubling up on Smoking Pipes and Emergency Aid from the Miskatonic Museum expansion, using the rat's health to shore up his sanity. Of course, there's always Charisma if you want to play the rat alongside Leo and have all the actions and all the items. That's a lot of action advantage for 5 XP or so. I wasn't overly impressed by the rat when I first saw him, but I think he has some potential. He's definitely worth keeping an eye on because his utility will only improve as more items are released in future expansions. The next card in the pack is a rogue event. This is Ace in the Hole. It's a free event that costs 3 experience points. However, it is exceptional, which means it will cost 6 experience points, and it is limit 1 per deck. It has the trick trait, and it has the game text fast. Play only during your turn. You may take an additional 3 actions this turn. So this card has been spoiled for a few months now, and it's an amazing addition to the Rogue's arsenal. The ability to take 3 extra actions, and quite possibly more when combined with cards like Leo DeLuca, Quick Thinking or Joy the Rat Vigil is incredibly powerful and will straight up win you the game if you time it correctly. My only caveat is the experience point cost. 6 is a hell of a lot to pay for one card that you might not see every game, but the designers needed to balance Ace in the Hole somehow, so I'm okay with that. As of the Dunwich Legacy campaign has progressed, we've had a better chance to gauge how many experience points investigators can reliably earn from each scenario. Most rogues should be able to afford this card if they do reasonably well during the first 2 scenarios of the Dunwich Legacy. That gives them access to Ace in the Hole for the remaining 6 scenarios, 8 if you take some side stories on, which is when you need a card like this. Combine it with a copy of Adaptable from the Miskatonic Museum and Streetwise from Blood on the Altar, and you've got yourself the making of a solid 10 XP deck that should do well in later scenarios. Of course, Skids will need to stay on top of his hospital debts if he wants to be able to afford this card sooner than later. Obviously, I'm pretty excited about Ace in the Hole, and I'm looking forward to testing it in a deck that tries to push the rogue action advantage mechanic to the limit. The first Mystic card in the pack is a zero-cost event called Moonlight Ritual. It has an Intellect and Agility icon, and the Spell and Insight traits. Its game text is short and sweet. Remove all doom from one card you control. Now, I'm really happy that a card like Moonlight Ritual exists, but at the moment I don't really see a reason to put it in your deck unless you're planning to abuse Blood Pact from Blood on the Altar or Alyssa Graham, an ally who was released in Undimensioned and Unseen. I've played around with both of those cards in various solo decks, and I haven't felt the need to include Moonlight Ritual to mitigate their downsides yet. That said, I tend to be fairly conservative when I use those cards in order to keep the doom total as low as possible. Now, your playstyle may differ, in which case adding a copy or 2 of Moonlight Ritual to your deck would let you really leverage those cards over the course of a scenario. Of course, you have to draw the Moonlight Ritual, which kind of puts you in an awkward position. Do you pile the Doom on Blood Pact and hope to draw the Moonlight Ritual? Or do you wait until you have the Moonlight Ritual in your hand first? Because you know there are going to be those games where Moonlight Ritual is going to be in the bottom 10 cards of your deck. I'd hate to pile a whole bunch of Doom on Blood Pact or Alyssa Graham in the hope of playing Moonlight Ritual and not see it. I can see this card being an auto-include in Marie Lambeau, the promo investigator released last year. She benefits from adding Doom to cards, but I haven't played with her, so I'm not really in a position to say whether she wants this card in her deck or not. I'm sure there will be plenty of cards released in future expansions that play around with the Doom mechanic. Until then, this card is only going to see limited play in a handful of decks, and even then you might find it simply easier to play without it. The second Mystic card in the pack is the level 2 version of Fearless from the core set. It's a skill with 2 willpower icons and the innate and developed traits, and it has the game text, if this skill test is successful, heal 1 horror, 2 horror instead if it succeeds by 2 or more. Now, here's a card that has Agnes written all over it. Everyone's favorite waitress loves this card because it lets her eke out even more damage from her response trigger, gunning down hapless enemies left, right, and center. When Agnes is set up, her willpower is usually at least 6 or 7, so she should have no problem passing your typical willpower check by 2 or more. Rotting Remains is a willpower 3 test, so if Agnes pitches a copy of Fearless to it, she's pretty close to beating it by +5, which I think is the sweet spot for these types of succeed by 2 tests. Now, the core version of Fearless is played frequently in Jim, Culver, and Daisy Walker decks as well, although I have seen it in the odd Zoe deck as well. I don't think Jim or Daisy are particularly interested in this card. Now, no investigator would turn down an extra sanity, but it's not nearly as important to them as it is to Agnes, who can convert any sanity she gains into raw damage. It's also slightly more difficult for them to reliably trigger the succeed by 2 clause, which means they won't get the full benefit out of this card. Both of them would be better off spending the 2 experience on cards that play to their strengths rather than shoring up their already substantial sanity pools. The solo Daisy deck I've been playing around with lately runs 2 copies of Forbidden Knowledge for the extra resources, and I've never really worried about running out of sanity to fuel it, so I don't think I'll be including this card in that deck. This isn't a flashy card by any stretch of the imagination, but it does make those machine gun Agnes decks just that much stronger, so it's definitely worth a look if you enjoy playing that style of deck. Now, if Jim Culver is your investigator of choice, you might be more interested in the next card in this Mythos pack. This is Jewel of Aurelios, or Aureolus, Aureolus, Gift of the Homunculi. It's a 3-cost asset that costs 3 experience points that takes up the accessory slot. It has a wild icon and the item and relic traits. It has the response trigger. After a skull, cultist, tablet, elder thing, or tentacle symbol is revealed during a skill test at your location, exhaust Jewel of Aurelios. Man, I just cannot pronounce the name of that card. You draw 1 card or gain 2 resources. At first blush, the Jewel kind of reminds me of a souped-up rabbit's foot, the survivor asset from the core set that lets you draw a card whenever you fail a skill test. The Jewel changes up the triggering mechanism and gives the investigator the option of taking 2 resources instead of a card. Now, first things first, you're probably playing this card for the resources rather than the card draw. Rabbitfoot doesn't see a lot of play in Agnes or Jim Culver decks these days because you can only trigger it once each round, and it competes for the accessory slot with Holy Rosary and Heirloom of Hyperborea. The Jewel suffers from the same 2 problems, costs 3 experience and 2 more resources to play, so it isn't exactly winning me over in those departments. You could pick up a copy of Relic Hunter so you could play your copy of Holy Rosary and the Jewel, but that you're looking at 6 experience, which seems like a lot for what you get out of it, especially if you choose to draw a card. I think you're probably best just taking the resources. Now, anytime you're talking about pulling tokens from the Chaos Bag, it's helpful to look at the math. And as usual, Jim comes out ahead. Agnes has a 33.33% chance of triggering the Jewel if she's pulling from a standard Chaos Bag of 18 tokens. Jim has a slightly better chance at 38.89% because he can treat the Elder Sign as a skull. Now, if Jim is equipped with his favorite toy, the grotesque statue, his chance jumps to a whopping 64%. And I like those odds of success a lot more. If you're playing it safe through the Dunwich Legacy campaign and watching carefully which tokens you add to the bag, your chance of triggering the Jewel dips to 26.67% if you're playing Agnes, and 33.33% if you're playing Jim, 57.14% if he's equipped with the statue. That's still pretty good, so it wouldn't hurt to add a copy of the Jewel to a Jim Culver deck if you feel like you need the extra resources. If not, you could always give this card a pass. The first survivor card in the pack is a Chance Encounter. It's a 1-cost event that has a willpower and intellect icon and the fortune trait, and its game text states, choose an ally asset in any player's discard pile. Put that asset into play under your control. At the end of the round, if that asset is still in play, discard it. Now, here's a fascinating little card with all sorts of applications for investigators who have allies in their deck, which is most of them at the moment. It's important to note that this card does take an action to play, so you're going to need to choose which ally you put into play carefully to maximize its effect. However, you're probably going to have plenty of targets, especially if you're playing in multiplayer. Allies with effects that trigger some abilities when they come into play are an obvious choice. Ashcan Pete could grab himself a laboratory assistant to draw himself a couple cards, or an art student to discover a clue at his location. Of course, he could also use the card to bring Duke back from the dead for a turn if his trusty hound met an untimely demise earlier in the scenario. If you're playing Agnes, you could bring back an Arcane Initiate to search for a spell, confident in the knowledge that it will disappear at the end of the turn, taking its doom with it. A Chance Encounter also works extremely well with Stray Cat from the core set. Stray Cat's free trigger basically allows you to play a Chance Encounter to automatically evade any non-elite enemy at your location. That's pretty powerful, especially in multiplayer if you're trying to lock down an enemy or you need to give one of your fellow investigators some breathing room. Of course, you could always grab one of the many allies capable of boosting one of your skills for a turn. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention one ally in particular who is coming out in Lost in Time and Space, the Red-Gloved Man. The Red-Gloved Man allows you to raise the base value of 2 of your skills to 6 as long as he is in play, which is absolutely amazing for the price of 1 resource. It's even better if you didn't have to pay for the experience to put him in your deck yourself. Now it's important to remember you can also use the ally you put in play to absorb some damage and horror before returning it to the discard pile. Is there a hunter enemy and an enemy with the hunter keyword at a neighboring location? It might be worth playing a chance encounter to return a guard dog to play to not only soak up some damage but dish some out as well. Now, a chance encounter might not look like much at first, but I think it's one of the most versatile cards in the Mythos pack. You can use it to trigger effects, boost skills, evade enemies, or soak up damage and horror, all for a single resource. And you're likely to have plenty of targets if you're playing in multiplayer, and it's only going to get stronger as more allies with more interesting come-into-play effects are released. This is a pretty cool card. I'm pretty excited about it. The next card in the pack is Stroke of Luck. It's a survivor skill that costs 2 experience points. It has a wild icon and the innate and fortune traits. It says commit only to a skill test you are performing. After revealing chaos tokens for this test, you may choose to exile Stroke of Luck. If you do, this test is automatically successful unless a tentacle token was revealed. Now here's an exile card I can get behind. I wasn't really crazy about some of the exile cards we've seen previous in the Dunwich Legacy, but I do like this one. The option to automatically succeed at a skill test is incredibly powerful, and I'd gladly pay 2 experience points for that type of effect, especially if the fate of the campaign was hanging in the balance. Now, Stroke of Luck's effect is similar to that of Will to Survive, the 4-cost survivor event from the core set that costs 3 experience points. Stroke of Luck may only affect 1 check, but it's a hell of a lot cheaper to play than Will to Survive. That probably makes it a better choice for all those decks out there that are running Dark Horse at the moment. It's hard to justify running an expensive event like Will to Survive in that type of deck because you're trying to keep your cost curve low in order to keep that stat boost from Dark Horse. Now, Stroke of Luck offers those decks access to a similar effect at a price point they can afford. I also like the fact that you get to choose whether to exile Stroke of Luck after the Chaos tokens are revealed. If the wild icon was enough to put you over the top, or you happen to pull a tentacle, you've lost nothing by pitching this to a test. I think investigators need some way to manipulate the results of the Chaos bag as the campaign's difficulty ramps up, or if you're playing on a higher difficulty like Expert or Hard. Now, I don't think you'll want to pick up this card too early in the campaign because that exile cost is going to add up fast if you're pitching this every scenario. However, if you're a survivor player heading into where Doom awaits or Lost in Time and Space and you've got a few experience points to spare, I think Stroke of Luck is an amazing addition to your deck. The first neutral card in the pack is Fine Clothes. It's a 1-cost asset with an agility icon and the item and clothing traits. It reads, reduce the difficulty of skill tests you perform during parlay actions by 2. Fine Clothes also has 1 health and 1 sanity, and it takes up the body slot. Well, there are only 2 parlay tests that I can think of in the game right now. There's the Intellect 4 test in the Parlor to take control of Leader Chandler during the Gathering, and there's the Intellect 3 test to take control of Jazz Mulligan, the head janitor, in extracurricular activity. So the opportunity to impress your friends and allies with your fine clothes is pretty limited at the moment. However, it does sound like we're going to be hanging out with a lot of high society types during the first 2 scenarios of the Path to Carcosa Deluxe expansion, so perhaps fine clothes will be of more use during those scenarios. Since the game text of Fine Clothes is almost never relevant in the Dunwich Legacy cycle, you're probably playing this one as one of the few cheap sources of health and sanity. Besides the Holy Rosary and Mystic and the neutral Elder Sign Amulet, which costs 3 experience points, this is the only source of extra sanity outside the ally slot. 1 resource for an extra health or sanity isn't terrible. There isn't a lot of pressure on the body slot either, Survivors have access to the leather coat, which is free and provides 2 health, while Guardians can pick up the bandolier, which costs 2 resources and provides a health. If you need a couple extra sanity on the cheap, Fine Clothes is an option, at least for some of the easier scenarios in the game. Still, this card isn't particularly great. Unless parlay tests become more relevant, this is probably the first card I cut from my deck to make way for something more powerful. The final card in the Mythos pack is Moment of Respite. It's a 3-cost event with 2 willpower icons that cost 3 experience points. It has the spirit trait and the game text. Play only if there are no enemies at your location. Heal 3 horror and draw 1 card. What a great way to end the pack. With the exception of a handful of cards such as Fearless, Smoking Pipe, and If It Bleeds, healing horror has traditionally been a very time-consuming affair in the Arkham Horror LCG. Cards like First Aid and Liquid Courage chew up your precious actions as you heal 1 horror at a time. Too bad investigators usually lose sanity in large chunks. Anybody who's pulled the tentacle on a Rotting Remains test knows exactly what I'm talking about. Moment of Respite breaks with these cards and gives you the chance to heal 3 horror for the cost of an action. The fact that the opportunity to cost to play this card and the fact that it replaces itself is just icing on the cake. I can imagine playing this card in a Wendy Adams deck with Wendy's Amulet on the table. Now you've got the option of healing 6 horror and drawing 2 cards, as long as you've got the resources to pay for it. Now 3 experience points is a little on the pricey side, but I don't think this card is intended to be among the first you sink your hard-earned experience points into. Most players will be content to see how the campaign develops before deciding whether they need Moment of Respite to shore up their shaky sanity. If the campaign is going poorly or the investigator has suffered some mental trauma due to a weakness such as cover-up or searching for Izzy, Moment of Respite suddenly becomes a lot more appealing. One exception to this will be Agnes, who loves this card. Much like the level 2 version of Fearless we looked at earlier in this Mythos pack, Moment of Respite enables her to heal a lot of horror quickly, so she can pile on even more horror to keep pumping out the damage. Besides Fearless, Agnes's only other option to heal horror is Clarity of Mind, which is incredibly slow compared to Moment of Respite, and takes up an arcane slot to boot. Players who want to focus on the machine gun Agnes archetype would do well to keep Moment of Respite in mind once they've picked up essentials, such as the level 2 version of Peter Sylvester. Moment of Respite isn't going to make the cut in every investigator deck, but it's a great option to have available if you need to shore up your investigator's sanity toward the end of a campaign. So those are the player cards from Where Doom Awaits. Overall, I'm really excited by a lot of the cards in this pack. There are a lot of powerful cards, such as Strange Solution, Acidic Eye, Coronation in the Hole, that are going to make an immediate impact in players' decks, as well as a few cards such as Joey the Rat Vigil and Chance Encounter, which are going to give deck builders some interesting toys to explore as more cards enter the card pool. Cards such as Fearless and Moment of Respite will strengthen Agnes decks, while the Jewel of the Jewel, we'll say, has already found a home in Jim Culver decks built by F-Bones that's making waves over on Arkham DB. Now, Fine Clothes is probably the weakest card in the set, but even it may turn out to be useful when the Path of Carcosa Deluxe expansion drops in a month or two. The designers are continuing to build on the game's strengths, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what they have to offer in Lost in Time and Space. That's going to do it for me today. If you enjoyed this review, I'd appreciate it if you would leave me a thumbs up. It helps out the channel a great deal. Make sure you hit that subscribe button to be notified about future content. Do you agree, disagree with this review, or you just want to chat about this great game? Please leave a comment down below. If you'd like to reach me, I can be contacted at manfromleng@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at manfromleng. Until the stars are right, keep your shotgun close and your elder sign closer. Take care out there, and happy investigating.